Happy Monday, everyone. My name is Tim Mikhelashvili, and I'm the host of the All Out Pharma Digital group that we had formed about a year ago in the pharmaceutical industry across various different companies and medical affairs. And it was actually through social media that I had a chance to first meet Darshan Kulkarni, our special guest today. Darshan, how are you today? How's your Monday?
Monday's been good. Monday's been busy, helping with a bunch of different clients and staying busy. Can't complain too much. And then I get to I had a meeting with I was doing my own podcast, as you know, and I had some problems with LinkedIn, and we had to reschedule. And I was worried about our conversation. It looks like we may have fixed the problem. We discovered that we had a problem, but we may have fixed it this time around.
Darshan Kulkarni is an eclectic man of many talents. He's a doctor of pharmacy. He's an attorney, esquire, professor at Drexel. He did his training at Temple as well. He advises many different companies in pharma, outside of pharma, on various regulatory issues that I think are going to be very interesting and timely for a lot of my colleagues and friends whom I've invited from various different professional associations as well. He's a life sciences council as well as a board member. And so, Darshan, I want to let you really introduce yourself appropriately for those in our audience so that they can have a better idea of potentially what questions to ask as well and what help you can provide them.
Sure. So my name is Darshan Kulkarni. I'm a pharmacist by training. I went back to law school, got my JD, and when I say went back, that was 20 years ago. I also have a master's in quality assurance regulatory affairs. So when you think of your PRC team, I am your one-man PRC team because when you think MLR, medical, legal, regulatory, I have a doctorate in pharmacy, a JD, and a master's in quality assurance regulatory affairs. I also clerk for a federal court judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania for the Honorable Clifford Scott Green. I also have a fellowship in professional geriatric care, about 20 years of experience in pharmacy as a pharmacist, and also about 15 years of experience as an attorney. I think that's about right. I could be off. No, that's right. Actually, more than that. I also do. So I have my own law firm that does FDA regulatory law and compliance. I serve on a few different editorial and advisory boards, including for FactMI, where I am director of compliance for them. I also let's see, what else do I do? I was chair of the life sciences section for the American Bar Association. Life Sciences Interest Group for the American Bar Association, where I land up writing the chapter on drug advertising, on drug advertising, pharmacy compounding, medical devices, and drug reimbursement. For HCCA, I wrote the chapter on clinical research. I'm currently working through a book on, so very, very early stages, but a book on medical affairs and medical science liaisons. I also wrote the chapter on the Indian pharmaceutical industry almost a decade ago. I have my own podcast where I talk to multiple interesting people, including hopefully you at some point, Tim, on the life sciences.
That would be my honor. Yes,
that'd be great. The other part, let's see. I was, in terms of my career, I've been general counsel, chief compliance officer. I was corporate counsel initially for a pharma company that was a generic company. I was then have my own firm for a while. While having my firm, I was VP of regulatory strategy and policy for one of the largest medical writing companies in the world who had a consulting arm. I then went back and then was general counsel, chief compliance officer for a healthcare startup out of the University of Pennsylvania. And I really don't want to get into the names, but yeah. Then there was my work. I tend to focus primarily on post-IND through the NDA into commercialization. So clinical research, medical affairs, sales compliance, genericization, buy and sell, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I like to think that I've actually helped companies develop the product and sold at the end of the life cycle. But yeah, so hopefully it gives your viewers an idea of what I do.
Yep. And I don't know how you find the time, Darshan, but I'm definitely inspired because I think that's staying consistent with our environment in which we have many more opportunities to learn and teach and connect within our industry and others as well. I definitely learn a great deal every time I attend your Darshan Talks podcast. So for everyone, Darshan Talks is the name of the podcast. I'll put it in the banner later.
I hope people enjoy it, and I appreciate you sort of putting it out there, and I hope people join and listen and hopefully learn as much from me as they learn from you.
Yes. Darshan, one of the reasons why I called this session the next generation of social media communications policies in pharma is I believe that there are a lot of changes in various regulatory policies in our environment and just the abundance of data, the volume, the velocity of the data and how it travels. I want to ask you a general question based on your observations,
Sure.
throughout your work with various pharma companies, whether it's in medical or outside of medical, to how up to date are our policies right now, our social media and digital communications policies, to be specific?
So I think that companies from large to small are actually developing and updating. So I think that you're seeing different ranges. You're seeing super small companies create social media policies. You're
Mhm.
seeing mature companies have social media policies going. How in line are they right now? And then there are then there are people who have policies, but they are potentially not as up to date, and that may be either on purpose or they may be because they just haven't gotten around to it. So I'll give you a couple of different examples. So there are large companies, for example, who have tremendous, really good social media policies, but they specifically don't reference the idea of off-label discussions, and that's
Mhm.
because they're either they don't want to, which is possible, or they've forgotten to, which is possible, or because they're being conservative. And that can result from a few different things. So number one, it can result from the fact that um, there has been in the recent past, and when I say recent past, I mean over the last decade, but several court cases where the court has admonished has admonished the FDA for being overly aggressive with its enforcement. And this has popped up more than a few times. The FDA put out a 60-something page memo talking about how they don't know what to do with off-label. If you compare this to say the 1998 or so, we had about approximately, and again, I'm talking, don't take the dates specifically, but around that time, about 195, 196 warning letters from at that point DDMAC. And now I think last year we had probably about 6. So that drop off had to do with numerous factors. One of which was the FDA is still trying to get its bearings on what happened. So the idea of developing social media policy starts with knowing what standard you are going to follow. And what standard you're going to follow is going to be largely dependent. Thank you again for posting that. The standard you follow is going to be largely dependent on what you offer and what you want to what you think is a reasonable standard to use. So, for example, just let's say healthcare practitioner engagement in general, right? People will say the policy is that you can engage with healthcare practitioners in certain formats, and this is not specifically social media. This is actually just healthcare engagement. But just 2 months ago, OIG came out and put out a response saying that there are going to be very specific situations it's okay to engage with healthcare practitioners, and sometimes the speaking arrangements may be too aggressive, which is not what a lot of people know about. So a lot of companies have not updated their engagement policies to reflect that. Pharma updated its policy probably around mid-January or so, so it's only about a month and a half old, but something to consider as you're updating. Now you start talking about things like space-limited engagements. So if that's true, are you going to have social media pages that are product-based? Or are you going to have social media pages that are company-based? Or are you going to have social media pages that are claims-based? Each of them results in a totally different group and requirements that may or may not be something that companies are considering. So the idea being that it's possible companies are a little bit more conservative this second, and appropriately so, depending on the company's own risk appetite. But they need to be thinking about what they want, how far they can go, who is managing the policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is that kind of responsive?
Yeah, thank you. Now, in terms of medical affairs versus sales, from what I remember, Darshan, from years ago when I was starting out my career, I realized that the FDA doesn't really discriminate from medical to sales reps in terms of, let's say, problems or with policies or violations of policies. To them, it's about whether or not there is any breach or any unlawful promotion practice or implicit or explicit. Right? Is that was my kind of general understanding, that whether I'm a medical liaison or a sales rep, I'm just as liable as they are, and just as likely to, let's say, violate some kind of regulatory issue. So what are any differences, if they still exist, between the level of risk, let's say, from medical to sales today?
So I think there are a few different things. So depending on when you're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a key component is that if you do medical, so there are a series of court cases from probably about the early 2000s that talk about this, where they basically say that medical affairs is technically engaged in quote unquote scientific discussion. If it's engaged in scientific discussion, it is afforded what's referred to as pure speech rights, and it's considered to be pure speech. So it's considered to be the same level as, say, political speech. And the government has to meet the standard called strict scrutiny. It has to really be very, very specific about what they prevent people from saying. On the other hand, commercial speech is held to a different standard. It's not held to that same rigor as pure speech, and there are less expectations around it. So medical affairs, if done right, falls into scientific discussion, and therefore have a lot more leeway about what they can say. On the other hand, sales is very clearly commercial speech. So that's one part of that discussion. The second part of that discussion is if you call yourself medical affairs, and then you go out there and you have a sales territory, and you market. You basically have a doctorate behind your name, but you then go out there and market your product. The question is, are you really working as a medical affairs person, and therefore do you have the safe harbor protections of the First Amendment? And the DOJ had multiple settlements in the early 2000s, which basically said no. Either you are in medical affairs and you are really protected by that First Amendment and you are engaged in scientific discussion, or you're a sales rep. And that distinction has gotten blurred. And I see that probably every 3 to 4 years, you get a wax and wane of where people are. So in the early 70s or so, you had, I think it was Upjohn who came out and basically created the super sales reps. And then it went all the way, probably 2010 or so, we started seeing these companies come out and say, well, why don't we give medical affairs well, like I said, in the 2000s, you created this pure speech, medical affairs only engages in scientific discussion. 2010 or so, why don't we give them sales territories? And once you got into the sales territories perspective, well, are they really engaged in scientific discussion at that point? And you had multi-billion-dollar settlements right around that time. And then you had the Coronia case, you had the IMS v. Sorrell case, you had the 3 different citizens petitions that all came out around that time. And when all those came out, the FDA was taking a back foot because they lost several of these. Well, all of those court cases that we're referring to. IMS v. Sorrell was obviously not an FDA case, but overall speaks to the First Amendment. But the result of that was you had the FDA asking and trying to figure out what their role is, because the FDA went to the courts and basically said, we've regulated based on approval forever. Why, if the court throws out this requirement that we regulate based on the standard of truthful and not misleading, it might upend the entire regulatory schema that has existed. And the court basically said that the regulatory the First Amendment, the way it's interpreted, has been changing since the 1980s. The FDA just hasn't updated it. So that's caused a lot of changes, a lot of updates, and you're seeing the impact of that even now. I believe earlier this year, the FDA said that they're going to create some kind of task force to address First Amendment concerns. So my point being, there have been multiple ways it's come up, and whether you see it in the context of the distinction between sales and medical affairs. I had someone come on to my podcast and talk about the fact that it's an arbitrary distinction from her perspective, because in the end, you are talking about product. On the other hand, some might argue that there is a free speech, non-free speech distinction. And there are court cases that speak about that. And then there's just multiple other ways and expressions possible to sort of address you as a company and help you understand what you can and cannot say. So overall, I would say that you're right in that you may be super up to date in that, is that distinction still valid? But I think companies are still working off of the 2000 or so framework, where there is a clear distinction between between MSLs, medical affairs, and sales. But we might see that get changed over the next 2 to 5 years. I would have thought we'd have had changed by now, but we aren't there yet.
Right. So there are many gaps that are still remain. And you mentioned the 2000s. That's when I actually started my career, as a medical liaison. Yeah. Maybe speaking a little bit more specifically regarding the types of social media communications policies, maybe you can share some ideas in terms of the distinctions from what can a pharma employee do safely versus what they can't. Let's say, can they repost their employer's, let's say, disease awareness kind of website, or product news, or a latest trial that or abstract thing, or can they comment to it, or what are the levels of activities that are now allowed, and those that are maybe scrutinized more? Can you give us a little bit more detail on? Yeah.
Sure. Let's play it out. And again, it's going to be scenario by scenario specific, and case by case specific. It's a fact-based discussion, but let's talk about in generalities. If you had a situation where you've got a sales rep, for example, reviewing a disease awareness ad, for example, right? So let's say someone puts out that you have diabetes, and you've got a sales rep who likes I'm sure there's a diabetes day out there, and they go out there and they say, you know what, we support my company's diabetes day. Great, there's no problem with that. Now you go out there, and instead of diabetes, you're now talking about the promotion piece, and the promotion piece comes out and talks about how your specific insulin helps with diabetes. Still, that promotional piece has been reviewed by your sales rep, by your PRC team. The sales rep at that point can still sort of highlight it, retweet it, like it, whatever they want to do, because it's already been approved by the PRC team. Okay. Now you take that same exact piece, and it has now, instead of coming out via a piece approved by the PRC team, it's a clinical trial study that has not gone through FDA approval, got pushed out by, say, medical affairs, as this is a new study that's come out. And let's say there was a process that happened, and there are numerous ways that can and cannot happen. But let's say that's what happened. In that specific scenario, you are now, as a sales rep, promoting an off-label discussion. And that causes all kinds of problems depending on your own company's policies and procedures. So it comes down to who is initially pushing it out, who is the audience, and are you, as the sales rep, acting in your role as an individual, in your role as a healthcare practitioner, or in your role as a representative of the company? And each of those will have different ramifications.
Okay. And
so clear as mud.
Yeah, no, but you're providing some guidance, I think, Darshan, to for the audience, the author of the indicate the different scenarios, because it's impossible to have one solution for all types of companies. And that brings me to, let's say, another question that I thought about, which was smaller companies versus the larger, well-known global top, let's say, 20 pharma companies. Is there a difference in terms of the level of scrutiny from regulatory authorities? Are the smaller companies have more freedom to institute, let's say, more liberal types of social, communication policies?
So I think smaller companies are less developed. It doesn't mean that they're freer. So it means that the FDA is still looking, and it's prime for the picking. However, if you were trying to draw a distinction, I think that the fact is that CDRH has significantly lower resources than OPDP. So OPDP, for example, has
what are those two? Could you, for those who may not know, could you define that? Because
so if you're in the drug world, you fall under CDR, and if you're a biologic, you fall under CBER, and CBER has something called so. If you're in the drug world, you fall under CDR, and you have a group called OPDP, Office of Promotion. I forget what it stands for. Office of Promotion and something products, but OPDP. They review your promotional pieces to make sure they're compliant, or at least to see if they have concerns. Then there is CBER, which is biologics, and that's regulated, reviewed. Those ad pieces are looked at by APLB. And then CDRH has its own group, and they look at pieces for devices. Of the three, OPDP is probably the most well-staffed. I think the last time I checked, it was something like 77 to 80 people who were in that process. CDRH, last time I heard, was 3. Now you think about all the medical devices out there, all of whom are making claims. Some of them are doing that compliantly using a 510K. Others are doing it under a PMA, and has different ramifications again with the regulatory strategy that's been used. If you recognize that part, you realize that there are just significantly less resources to do the policing for medical devices than for drugs. But on the other hand, drugs also have a lot more rules in place, because they just have the resources to give you those rules. On the other hand, that doesn't quite exist in the case of devices. So it's a little bit more of a wild, wild west situation compared to drugs, not because they want it that way, but because of just a different set of resources that are available. So if you were asking who gets more scrutinized, I would argue CDRH gets less scrutinized than CDR, for example. On the other hand, if you compare large and small, I don't think you see the same. You see a real distinction between the two. You see large and small companies get scrutinized just as easily. In terms of prosecutions, if you're like a very, very early stage startup, unless they want to make an example out of you, or they want to make a larger point, it's not typically where OIG, FDA, OPDP directs its resources. Having said that, there are numerous instances where they have, but it's really been more, let me make a point here, as opposed to that we think we're going to go after you. On the other hand, if you are one of the large pharma, you have deeper pockets. And if you have deeper pockets, DOJ and OIG are more willing to spend the resources to track you down and make sure that you pay for potentially misleading people, because you are the standard, as you know, is truthful and not misleading. So the
Right.
cost of truthful and not misleading comes down to who has the pockets to pay for that. And large pharma has those pockets, while super small pharma does not.
Yeah. So where, the reason why I'm smiling is because where do you draw that line in terms of what is misleading and what isn't is now probably under question, given that, I've seen some recent statistics that patients themselves are moderating and are leading these discussions regarding decisions that affect their life, right? These medical
Mhm.
decisions. They're demanding treatments. I saw some research, Darshan, that shows that out of all dermatology related hashtags on Instagram, for example, only 5% of them are authored by board certified dermatologists. So that's
Sure.
the reality out there. That's the environment. And that's what I think we in medical, in pharma, and also in our regulatory policies have to reflect just what misleading may mean or may not mean based on who it is, who the author is, and how we're allowed to engage with KOLs. Because, in your example, I think the startup companies, what makes a startup different from larger companies is that it's velocity of decisions, I think, and probably engagement and networking. So while other bigger companies may be fleshing out their compliance policies and in order to reach physicians in various ways, those startups may be engaging deep on a deeper level or in more modern via modern methods, let's say, I don't know, is something that I'm hypothesizing. But so the question is, like, what can you give us a little bit more detail in terms of how the regulatory agencies are defining misleading today versus years ago? Is that changing at least, or?
It's again, the rules haven't changed.
Mhm,
Interpretation of the rules is in flux. So
mhm,
I'll tell you what I mean by that sentence. So
mhm,
if you think about it, the fact is that if you the FDA really has three levels, three standards out there to evaluate whether something is okay, if a statement made is okay. You have the lowest standard, which is CARS, which is competent, reliable scientific evidence. That's the
mhm,
lowest
mhm.
standard. Then
Okay.
there's the higher standard that FDA really doesn't use, but it exists. It's called substantial scientific evidence, I believe,
Mhm,
and it's very, very rarely used. I can't even think of when it was last used. And then there's the actual standard for clinical claims, which is substantial evidence. And that's the standard. Typically speaking, substantial evidence is two double-blinded, placebo-controlled, multi-center, multinational studies,
right.
also known as adequate evidence that goes into that same standard, if you will.
Mhm,
Um, so that's the overarching standard that people use. Now, remember that there's also FDAMA 114, which I believe, again, I'd have to double check, but FDAMA 114, I believe, is the CAR standard still. But each of these, depending on what kind of claim you're making, you have to adhere to a different standard. And that's the expectation from the FDA when it comes to what constitutes truthful and not misleading. So if you come out and you say, I have a case study involving one patient, and we cured cancer,
mhm.
ignoring the fact that cancer is like 50,000 diseases, but
Right.
we cured cancer.
Yep.
And it's based off of one case study. It's unlikely you're going to meet the substantial evidence standard, but you're
Uh-huh.
making a clinical claim. So you're very clearly not meeting that substantial evidence standard, and therefore you are not truthful and not misleading. On
Yep.
the other hand, and that's sort of where you're getting a lot of these COVID-19 cures that were really based on dietary supplements, which were tested on like mice. You're seeing those claims come through, and the FDA is going, you don't meet that standard. On the other hand, FTC uses the standard associated with CARS, which is competent, reliable scientific evidence. And it's a lower standard used in other situations.
Mhm.
So that might be something like ease of use claims,
Right.
and that's a different standard you use. So each of those will play a role in what constitutes truthful and not misleading.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah.
Great. So yeah, this definitely calls for lots of notes from this podcast that I'll be sharing on my blog. I'm a Dev Pharma blog. Social media is one popular way to communicate, but then you have internal ways to communicate that leaves a trail or document, right? Documents that many companies are sensitive about. So, however, a lot of that is also changing in terms of our productivity. We have so many different formats of data, either structured or unstructured, that ultimately impacts our decisions, how we communicate from the pharma perspective, from medical, with our scientific experts, let's say.
Sure.
Do you see a trend among all the companies that you advise in terms of the tools that are used and their to communicate internally, not just externally, in terms of, let's say, Slack, for example? I know that a lot of tech companies use Slack, and I find it that it's you have an immediate feedback and just lots of capabilities there, but that's not accepted use in throughout pharma. Yes, we use Salesforce for our customer relationship management tool on the sales and but can you provide any your thoughts and in terms of the different formats of communication and how they're changing, or the potential or the need for their change in throughout pharma?
I think it's, again, always situation dependent, right? So it's not like I can speak. I mean, I know pharma companies using Slack. I know pharma companies using
I
Teams.
didn't know.
Oh yeah,
Wow.
absolutely.
Yeah. Oh.
I know pharma companies using Teams because they already bought
Right.
into the entire infrastructure associated with it.
Right.
And then you've got people buying into a bunch of different tools like Asana and Trello and just other Monday, I believe, is another one. And they use all of these tools as well. Then you've got companies that are more structured about the way they engage, and they might say that we have a custom platform that we want you to use. They have their own intranets that will communicate. But obviously, with COVID and stuff, those initial, everyone comes to the office, we're going to have a meeting and we're going to talk through things, that format's disappearing in the same way. So using things like internal meetings doesn't quite work out the same way, especially when you're a large pharma and you've got 40,000 people who go to attend the meeting. Yeah, you can do a bulletin board, but it doesn't enable you to have continuous two-way communications.
Right.
When you're talking, for example, a lot of stuff I do is in PRC. You've got a bunch of different tools out there, everything from a Primo to Pepperflow to Viva. All of them are different tools to communicate between managers and team members. So it all comes down to the format, the forum, the goal. You've got to be careful, for example, internally speaking, even if you're speaking internally, just the fact that you say something remember, it's still a recording. And if it is a recording, someone can come in after the fact and say, you said X and the company ignored you. Even though you were saying it as something that's in flow, in process,
right.
If it can come back to haunt you. So you've got to be careful about what you say and how you say it. It's important that you consider different iterations, but it's also important that you consider that we're now working and living in a space where every iteration is controlled. And that's really what Part 11 compliance really spoke to in the first place. So keep that in mind as you continue.
You alluded to a company that's pushing the envelope a little, the boundaries somewhat, or that's using a lot of the innovative technologies. Can you share, to the level of detail that you're allowed to legally, of course, any best practice or any company that, let's say, just recently changed their social media communication policies, and what that change was in general terms, and what was, let's say, the outcome, any benefit, any advantage, or the opposite? I mean, if that's the case.
I think that companies are still evolving. I think that the companies that I'm working with are, I'd say probably 2, 3, 4 years ago, they basically just said, we're not doing social media. We're not doing social media because we don't know what to expect. The FDA is not clear about its expectations. I think you're seeing a shift over to, okay, we're going to do social media. The question is now what? So you're seeing the large promotional companies, ad agencies come out and say, yes, we will do social media. So maybe we can start putting claims out there. Remember, there is a guidance out there on space-limited information. So how you comply, it's not whether you can do it, it's how you can do it and what can you say. So it's really hard to do a disease claim on Twitter, for example. Not because it's inappropriate, but because you can't do fair balance on Twitter unless you use certain strategies. So keep that in mind, and don't necessarily just trust that your ad agency knows what they're doing. They're trying to push the envelope as well.
Mm-hmm.
So when you are in medical, recognize that fair balance, if you're in pharma, is a requirement. So how are you going to meet that standard becomes something you need to consider. When I start looking at these clients, the multiple clients across the team, the best practices, if you will, have been really having. So I've worked with companies who will say, we just want to put things out there. You either say yes or no, and we'll keep going. That's fine. Um, but I find that to be a little bit more complicated in terms of you always have roadblocks. On the other hand, if you, for lack of a better term, pre-game and you go, does this concept work? What are the issues that may stop this product from going through? In those specific situations, it's important that that the pre-gaming happen, and that'll enable a much smoother PRC review. And therefore enable better communications with patients, with caregivers, with healthcare providers. So I think that's probably some of the overall things to consider as you're engaging.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that was very helpful. You mentioned PRC several times. Has that process that many people consider a dreaded process been shortened or streamlined?
So again, I can speak to, and I didn't come on here to make promotions for myself, but for example, I have a company that has what's called a Minos process, and what that
Uh-huh.
is it's an outsourced MLR process. So instead of making your PRC team review something 10 times,
Right.
and that's causing delays and the like, and you're looking at 6-week cycle times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, right.
What also becomes useful is to have someone else review and clean up. You basically get two sets of eyes on the problem. You get a faster turnaround process, and the result of that is a faster PRC process, because you're getting someone buy into the process early on, and then come out and say, someone else gives a second check and says, okay, this is fine. That's one method I know has been used to be sort of successful. There are some other tools out there, and I have no money in that or anything, but I've been told that there are some tools that do digital or AI review. I have a piece of software that really talks about essentially ask the right questions and says, please go through these questions, evaluate these questions, and see if they work for you. And that enables you to review the process, review your ad, review your claims,
Mhm.
and therefore when PRC looks at them, it's a lot faster to go through those claims as opposed to giving something and hoping that PRC thinks that it's okay. So it gives you more of a quick and dirty system to evaluate. So there are tools, but overall the process has stayed the same for several decades at this point. So
Right.
it's still as painful for some people as
Yeah.
it's always been. So it's important to have those conversations, those communications.
Okay. Reaching patients is something that I'm thinking about more and more, because as I see a lot of medical affairs organizations and pharmaceutical companies build a dedicated patient advocacy department, and where
Yeah.
before we've considered that to be a more of a commercial function, DTC as direct to consumer, the review that you're just talking about. But I think now, patients are becoming at the they're at the forefront of decision making, and they
Mm-hmm.
have telemedicine visits. So what are some privacy issues, those AI, what are some ways that we can maybe be a little bit more active in communicating with patients? Any suggestions you have, or anything that you've gathered?
I think the overall perspective is that, remember, patients do want to hear from you. Patients do want the information. Remember that the FDA is now advocating that you communicate and connect with patients. They actually just put out guidance, not that I want to say in the last 2 weeks, on engaging with patients appropriately, what types of
Okay,
questions you
great.
can ask, and the like.
Mhm.
There's an entire system out there. FDA is talking about appropriate ways to engage. If you look at the EMA, they actually have delay summaries where they want you to communicate clinical study results with patients. So if you're talking about these different things, we can absolutely talk about how these different agencies want you to communicate with patients. The fact then becomes, okay, you've got agencies that are saying you should communicate. how does that, let's take the FDA. FDA says we want you to communicate with patients. However, when you're talking about clinical trials, that becomes more complicated because technically speaking, it's not approved by the FDA. So is that in violation of OPDP requirements? So you've got to evaluate OPDP requirements connected to, say, a clinicaltrials.gov or a lay summary guidance out there, or connected to something like the ICMJE requirements, which many journals are coming out and saying, if you're going to submit to us, we want a lay summary associated with it. Well, if you're going to put out a lay summary, does that constitute a violation of your OPDP requirements? And again, these all need to be considered. So these are methods, there are ways, and it's a good idea for companies to have a patient group that connects with them. I'm not sure. I'm going to use the word patient advocacy, but I don't mean patient advocacy in that you are trying to push something to patients. I mean patient advocacy in that I think you need companies, you need individuals who are advocating for the rights of patients to be involved in their own decision making, and how that happens from a company is kind of important. So I think these will all be considerations as we continue.
Okay. Just something on clinical trials that you mentioned triggered a question regarding how is the transparency of clinical trials now changing? How are the current and latest regulations impacting on how transparent we can be or we have to be in pharma?
So again, when you're a pharma, you're not dealing with one country at a time or one block of countries at a time. At this moment, there are at least 7 different types of clinical trial transparency, which most people don't even know. But I'll quickly recite what they are. You've got just clinicaltrial.gov requirements, which is basically you need to declare that there is, if you're the appropriate type of study, that there is a clinical trial. Then there is a requirement of you did a clinical trial, here are the results associated with the clinical trial. Then you've got the requirement that you did the clinical trial, here are the results, but in lay summary format so that patients can understand them. So plain language summaries. Then you have, here are the clinical trials, we did the study, here's the actual raw data that came out. So the data transparency. Then there's here's the clinical trial, we did the research, we are going to promise to publish any research, whether it's good or bad. So so that's another goal. Then there's we did the clinical trial, the results are okay, are what they are. We filed with the FDA, here are or EMA, here are the clinical study reports, and redacted appropriately for privacy and for company confidentiality. So that's 6. And then there's this new upcoming one, which is we're doing the clinical trials, we're publishing in the appropriate medical journals, but we'd like to consider maybe creating summaries of them for healthcare providers so that they don't have to read a full dense article. Let me create something that's understandable to healthcare practitioners. Just because they can understand something doesn't mean that they want to read a 20-page article that's super dense. So what is a more readable, understandable format? So those are the 7 different types of clinical trial transparency that exist, and those are all evolving as well.
Great. Well, Darshan, thank you so much. I know that there's going to be a blog article coming up on this, and there's going to be more conversations that you and I are going to have hopefully with Medical Affairs Professional Society. I know that there were a number of different academic institutions throughout the last 2 years in various therapeutic areas that actually discontinued fellowship training programs just because of how they adapted or actually didn't adapt. There's been such a great variability on how we've adapted to this, omni-channel ways of communication in healthcare, where I've seen a lot of others actually be innovative, and innovation lies somewhere at the fringes, of these regulations that I think need to be up to date. So I really appreciate your support of the innovation in healthcare and you keeping all of us informed. And to make better medical decisions ultimately, and to improve quality of healthcare, which I think is the primary objective for us, all of us in the pharmaceutical industry. And I just want to leave the last word to you in terms of if you were to share one lesson or something that my colleagues, whether in pharma, whether in medical or in sales, need to know about now, or what you want them to change? The floor is yours, Darshan. I just want you to share any message that you have.
Sure. I think the real message that I would say is that if people come to me and go, all these regulations, there's so many regulations, they're constantly evolving. How do you keep track of them? How do you sort of comply with all of them? It's next to impossible. I can totally understand that perspective. Here's the way I look at things. I think you said this best, which is, in the end, we're doing all of this for patients. Look out for the best interests of the patients. If you look out for that best interest of the patients, and I mean that in every way, chances are that the laws, the regulations will all line up so that you will be looking out for the best interest of the patients. So start with a goal of addressing your patient's needs. The laws and the regulations and the like will all line up for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Darshan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It was an honor and a pleasure.
Pleasure. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.